Cowboy's little sister was dying of polio. A mute runaway healed her and gained a family. The brace was the first thing I'd see every morning. Hung on the post at the foot of Della's bed, leather straps and iron stays, the shape of a leg that couldn't hold itself up anymore. I'd look at it before I looked at her. Couldn't tell you why. Maybe it steadied me for the rest of it, for the smell of the room, which was camphor, and something underneath the camphor I didn't have a name for, and for the sound of her breathing, which had gone shallow in a way that frightened me more than I let show. She was 14 years old. She'd been sick 6 weeks. I'd built that brace myself in the barn. Measured her leg by hand, boiled the leather soft, bent the iron over a form I whittled from scrap pine. I'd never built anything like it in my life before. Took me 3 tries to get it close to right. Doc Alderman had sent one from Cheyenne, charged me $11 for it, and it fit wrong and left sores on her hip. So I built my own. That's what you do. You do what the thing in front of you requires, and you don't stop to ask if you know how. That's mostly what those 6 weeks were, doing what the thing required. Our name was Calhoun, Russ Calhoun. The ranch sat at the low end of the Pryor Creek drainage, just shy of the Montana line, not prime country, not the grass the big outfits ran on, but ours. 80 acres of it bought by my father in 1861, added to in pieces when I could manage, and now running about 200 head on a good year. Not a big operation. Not a proud one to look at, but solid, the way something solid looks when you've put yourself into it so long it starts to take your shape. Della was born late to my parents, surprise child, they called her, which she hated and which was true. I was 22 when she came. Our mother died 3 years after that, and our father held on another 7 before his heart gave out one January morning while he was breaking ice on the water tank. Left me with the ranch and a 10-year-old girl and not much else. I didn't mind the arrangement. I minded that he was gone. Della I did not mind one bit. She had her mother's dark eyes and his stubborn mouth, and she'd follow me around the place asking questions I mostly couldn't answer, and I'd answer them anyway, wrong half the time. She had a good life here, I thought. That's what I thought before the sickness. The polio came through in late summer. Hit 2 boys in town first, then a family out near the Kimball spread, then it crossed the creek and came to us. I don't know how she got it. I've gone over it 100 times and I don't know. She woke up on a Wednesday with a headache and stiffness in her neck, and I thought nothing of it, gave her willow bark tea and told her to sleep. By Friday she couldn't lift her left leg off the mattress. By Sunday we knew what we had. Doc Alderman came out, looked at her, told me to keep her cool and rested and to pray. He didn't say it unkindly, it was just honest. There wasn't much else. He'd seen 5 cases in the valley that summer. 2 of the children had died. So that became my life. The ranch in the morning, Della in the afternoon and evening. Cooking for her, keeping the room aired out, doing the stretches Alderman had shown me, moving her legs slow through its range so the muscle wouldn't seize up and stiffen for good. She bore it without crying, which told me how much it hurt, because she had never been a child who cried much, and when she did, you listened. Some nights I'd sit in the chair beside her bed and read to her out of the almanac or a catalog because those were the only books we had. She'd fall asleep and I'd keep reading to myself. I don't know why. The sound of the words maybe, something that wasn't just the wind. I was 53 years old and I'd been alone most of my life, and I knew how to be alone, but that fall I understood something different about it, being alone in a room with someone you couldn't help. That's its own kind of alone. That's the one that gets into you. She came on a Tuesday in the first week of October, when the aspens up on the ridge had gone gold, and the mornings were cold enough to fog your breath. I was out repairing a section of the south fence that the elk had pushed through the night before, on my knees in the frost with a roll of wire, and when I stood to stretch my back I saw something moving along the creek bottom to the north. Small figure, too slow for a deer, wrong shape for anything else. I watched it for a while before I went to see. She was sitting in the cold water of the creek up to her shins, shoes off, and she was washing her feet. That's what she was doing when I found her. Just washing her feet in a creek cold enough to numb your hands in 30 seconds. She looked up when I came through the willows, but she didn't run, which surprised me. Most people startled and ran. I'd say she was 25, give or take. Narrow through the shoulders, but not frail, you could see in the way she sat, and how she looked at me that she wasn't frail. Dark hair, heavy and unwashed, pulled back with a piece of twine. A bruise along the left side of her jaw, yellow at the edges, a few days old. She was wearing a man's coat 2 sizes too large and a dress under it that had been mended many times in many different threads. She just looked at me. No greeting, no flinch, no explanation. I said, "Good morning, you all right?" She didn't answer. Not a pause before answering, just no answer. looked at me the way you'd look at a horse to see if it was the biting kind. I said, "You're going to freeze your feet off. Water's not much above freezing." She looked down at the water and back at me. I said, "I've got a place up the hill, fire going. I can fix something to eat if you haven't eaten." And she stood up out of the water, barefoot on the rocky bank, picked up her shoes and followed me, just like that. I didn't know what to make of it. I still don't know entirely. At the house, I gave her the chair closest to the stove and put her shoes near the heat and heated up what was left of the morning's coffee and cut bread. She ate like someone who'd been making food last a long time, small bites, methodical. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and held it more than she drank it. I said, "I'm Russ Calhoun. This is my place." She nodded. I said, "You got a name you want to give me?" She looked at me a moment, then slowly shook her head. "Not no, I don't have one. More like, not right now. That's not something I can do right now." I said, "All right." I was quiet a bit, drinking my own coffee. Then I said, "You can talk if you want. I'm not going to press you." She reached into the pocket of the big coat and came out with a stub of pencil. Looked at me and then around the room, like she was asking if there was paper. I got her a piece from the drawer where I kept the feed receipts, and she wrote on it and pushed it across the table. "I don't talk, it isn't that I won't." I read that twice, then I said, "All right, you want more coffee." She turned the paper over and wrote, "Yes, please." That was how she told me that first morning. Not a long explanation. Not a story about what happened to her voice, no details offered. Just those 4 words and the pencil and the fact of it put out plain. And I took it plain, the same way you take any fact: this water's low, the roof needs work, this woman does not speak, and you go on from there. I didn't know what to do with her. That first day I mostly did nothing, let her sit by the stove and warm up, and when she seemed steadier I showed her the spare room at the back of the house, which had a cot and a hook on the wall and not much else. She stood in the doorway looking at it and nodded, and I left her to it. I checked on Della, did the stretches, read to her from the catalog, made soup for supper. I brought a plate to the spare room door and knocked and set it on the floor and went away, because something told me she'd be more comfortable that way. In the morning, she was at the stove already when I got up, stirring something. She'd gone into the pantry and found what was there and made a proper porridge, thick and hot, the way my mother used to make it with just a little salt and nothing else. I don't know how she knew to make it that way. She set a bowl in front of me and one for herself, and we sat and ate. After, she wrote on the back of the feed receipt, which she'd kept in her pocket, "I'd like to work for my keep. Whatever you need." I thought about it, said, "I won't turn that down, but you're not obligated. Stay a few days anyway. You look like you've had a rough stretch." She wrote, "More than a few days if that's all right." I said, "It's all right with me." She wrote, "Is there someone else I should ask?" I said, "My sister. She's sick. She won't turn you away either. She's not the turning away type, but she's the other person in this house." She looked at the closed door of Della's room. She wrote, "What sickness?" I said, "Polio, 6 weeks now." Something shifted in her face. A careful, watching look. She wrote, "What does the doctor do for her?" I told her what Alderman had told me. Rest, fluids, the stretches, keep her warm but not hot. She listened with that careful look and wrote, "Can I see her?" I said, "Let me ask her first." Della said yes without hesitating. She was curious about everything, even now. I won't try to explain what happened over the days that followed, because I don't have a full explanation for it. I only know what I saw. The woman, I'd started thinking of her simply as that, the woman, because she hadn't offered anything else yet. She went into Della's room that first morning and sat with her a good long while. I could hear Della talking through the wall, doing enough talking for both of them, which was normal for Della. When I looked in an hour later, the woman was doing the stretches. Not the way I did them, which was careful and mechanical, the way Alderman had shown me. She did them with her eyes half closed and her hands completely quiet on Della's leg, like she was reading the muscle through her palms, moving it a little differently than I would have, slower in some places and with more range in others. Della's face didn't have the tight look it had when I did them. That afternoon, the woman came to me at the woodpile and wrote, "Do you go to town?" I said, "Tomorrow. I go Wednesdays." She wrote, "Can I write a list of things to get?" I said, "You can come yourself if you want." She shook her head, quick, definite. I said, "A list is fine." She wrote 2 pages of the feed receipt paper, both sides. I looked it over. Some things I knew: willow bark, which I had, and chamomile, and some I'd never heard of. Burdock root, arnica tincture, something called boneset, a thing she'd written as slippery elm bark, and a pot, she wrote, a ceramic one with a lid if the mercantile has it, not tin. At the bottom she'd written, I know this is strange. I understand if you don't want to. I looked up from the paper. She was watching me from across the yard, standing very still. I said, I'll see what they have. I didn't tell anyone in town what the list was for. Picked up what I could find. The mercantile had most of it, and Alma Prout, who ran the place, looked at me sideways over her glasses but didn't ask. Got the ceramic pot from the shelf where they kept the canning supplies. Drove home with it all rattling around in the wagon bed. The woman was at the kitchen table when I came in. She unpacked everything I'd brought with the same methodical care she'd shown eating, checking each thing, setting it in order. Then she looked at me and wrote, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me yet. I still don't know what any of that is." She allowed something that might have been a smile. Over the next few days she made things. I watched when I could without being in the way. She stripped the burdock root and put it to soak. She dried the boneset in tight bundles hung from the kitchen ceiling. She made a poultice from the arnica. I watched her hands while she worked, quick and exact, measuring by feel rather than by any standard I could see. The kitchen smelled different. Not unpleasant, green and something else. She gave Della teas I didn't know. Explained each one to me first in writing on her paper. This one is for the inflammation in the muscle, she'd write, and then she'd wait for me to nod before she'd give it. She wasn't secretive. She wanted me to know what she was doing. She just couldn't tell me out loud. And Della, I need to say this plain because I don't want to make it sound like something it wasn't, like a miracle out of a story. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't like a lamp being lit. It was a slow and unglamorous thing, like watching grass come up. But over the days after the woman started, Della's color was better. Her appetite came back a little. She stopped waking at night with the muscle spasms in her leg that had been grinding her out of sleep for weeks. Alderman came by on his rounds in the 3rd week of October and examined her and said quietly, out in the yard where Della couldn't hear, that she seemed better than he'd expected. He didn't ask about the woman at first. Then he did. I told him I had some help at the house and that she'd been doing some additional care. He asked what kind. I said I wasn't sure of the technical terms, but that it seemed to be helping. He looked at me for a moment and said, I'm not going to argue with what I'm seeing. Keep doing it. Then he got in his buggy and left. That's as much as I can tell you about the medicine side of it. She knew something. Where she learned it, who taught her, how long she'd known, she never told me then, and it was a long while before I understood anything about where she'd come from. But she knew. Her hands knew. She'd been with us 4 weeks before I understood the bruise on her jaw wasn't the only bruise. It came out sideways, the way most things you need to know about a person come out. Not in a conversation, not in a direct asking, but in a small thing at the edge of something else. I was bringing in wood one afternoon, and I came around the corner of the house, and she was hanging wash on the line, and her sleeves were rolled, and I saw the marks on her forearms. Old ones, faded, but enough of them and shaped enough that there was no question what they were. She saw me see them, and she put her sleeves down without hurry, no rush to it, just a steady, unhurried pulling of the cuffs down, and she didn't look away from me when she did it. I kept walking to the woodpile, stacked the wood, went inside. Later that evening, after Della was asleep, I sat at the table and the woman was at the other end with her own cup, and I said, You don't have to tell me anything. I just want you to know that nobody's going to come here and take you. Not from my place, whatever you're running from. She looked at me for a long time, then she got her paper. She wrote, How do you know I'm running from something? I said, Because you don't have a name you want to give me, and you won't go to town, and you've got 4 weeks of looking over your shoulder every time a wagon comes down the road. She looked at what she'd written and then at me. She wrote, I haven't been looking over my shoulder. I said, You've been listening for it. A pause, then she wrote, Yes. I said, Well, I just want you to know what I said. She sat with that a while. Then she wrote on the paper, slower than usual, His name is Verl Ashby. He's my husband. We were married 3 years ago in Sheridan. He's not a good man. I left in August. I said, Does he know where you are? She wrote, I don't think so. I walked a long way before I came to your creek. I said, All right. She wrote, That's all you have to say. I said, What else is there to say? You're here, he's not. I don't mean to let that change. She looked at me across the table, that careful watching look again. Then she turned the paper over and on the back she wrote something she hadn't written before. She wrote, "My name is Clara." I said, "Clara, all right." She gave me one slow nod, like something had been decided, and picked up her cup. The snow came early that year. First real snow in the second week of November, not a dusting, a proper covering, 8 inches by morning, the valley folded up white and quiet. I spent the day breaking it off the barn roof and knocking it back from the chicken coop and checking the stock. Clara, it felt right now, using the name now that she'd given it. She brought coffee out to me twice during the day without being asked. Just appeared at the barn door with a cup and left it on the rail and went back in. Small thing, I don't know why it stayed with me. It just did. Della was walking again by then. Not easily, not without the brace, but walking. She'd come 6 feet down the hallway the week before and stood at the door of the main room gripping the frame, grinning in a way that went straight through me, grinning at Clara mostly, who'd been there to see it. Clara had put her hands on Della's shoulders and looked at her, just looked at her, the way you look at something you're glad about. I'd had to go out to the barn, just needed to for a few minutes. Alderman came again in late November, and when he examined Della, he sat very still on the edge of the bed afterward and said, "Russ, I need to tell you something." He said he couldn't explain the rate of recovery he was seeing. He'd seen polio take a leg and keep it, seen it leave a person diminished for life. He'd expected that for Della. He didn't know what to attribute the improvement to, but that it was real and measurable, and that her strength was coming back. He asked again about Clara. I told him a little more this time. He listened and asked a few careful questions, and then he said, "You understand that what she knows, whatever it is, if it could help other children in this valley." I said, "You'd have to ask her. It's not mine to offer." He nodded and left, and that evening I told Clara what he'd said. She was quiet with it for a long while. Then she wrote, "I'm not sure I know enough to teach. I've always just done it." I said, "Maybe that's where teaching starts." She looked at the paper, wrote, "Maybe." The man came in December. I'll tell it straight. No particular drama in the telling of it, because there was no drama in the doing of it. It happened the way most serious things happen, quick, cold, with very little room to think. I was at the barn when I heard the horse. Single rider, coming at a pace that was too purposeful for a passerby. I came around the side of the barn with a piece of tack in my hand, and saw him coming down the road from the north, big man on a gray horse, wearing a yellow duster, riding like a man who'd been riding hard and was close to where he was going. He pulled up in the yard and looked around and then looked at me. He said, "You Calhoun?" I said, "I am." He said, "I'm looking for a woman, come through here maybe a couple months back. Dark hair, don't talk." I looked at him, said, "Who are you?" He said, "Verl Ashby, she's my wife." I said, "What makes you think she came through here?" He said, "Man in town said he thought he'd seen a woman matching that description heading up this creek road. That was yesterday. You seen her." I said, "I see a lot of people on this road." He looked at the house. Long look. He said, "I'll just take a look around if you don't mind." I said, "I do mind." He looked back at me. I've known men who lead with that look their whole lives, that measuring look that's deciding whether the thing in front of them can be pushed. He was deciding that now. I said, "This is my property. You come onto it uninvited, that's trespassing. You want to come onto it, you can present yourself to Sheriff Delaney in Bridger and explain your situation, and if he thinks there's grounds, he can come out with you. That's how it works." He sat his horse for a moment. The gray stamped and shook its head. He said, "She's my wife, that's the law." I said, "Then use it, go see Delaney." He looked at the house one more time. Then he looked at me in a way that meant he'd be back, and he turned the horse and rode back the way he'd come. I went inside. Clara was at the kitchen table. She'd heard, she was looking at the door. I said, "He's gone." She wrote on her paper, "He'll come back." I said, "He might. I want you to know something. If he comes back with the sheriff or with papers of some kind, I'll have to figure out what the law says. I don't want to lie to you about that. But short of that, I meant what I told him. This is my property and you're here because you're here. Far as I'm concerned, that's the beginning and end of it." She looked at what she'd written, then she looked at me. Her eyes were very dark and very steady. She wrote, "Why are you doing this?" I thought about that. I said, "Because you're good. Because what you've done for Della is more than I could have done myself. Because you looked me in the eye the first morning I found you and didn't ask me for anything and didn't try to take more than you needed. Those are reasons enough. She sat very still with that. I said, and because whatever he did to earn those marks on your arms, that's not something that should follow a person forever. She turned the paper over. She wrote, "No one has ever said that to me before, not in those words." I said, "Well, it's true." She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. We sat there a while. Della was asleep in her room, and the stove was going, and the snow was coming down again outside the window, and that was all. Ashby came back in the second week of January. He came with a man I didn't know, not the sheriff, not a deputy, just a man, rough-looking, riding a roan. They came at night, which was the giveaway, because men with legal standing don't come to your door at night. I'd been half expecting it, and I'd sent word to Delaney and Bridger the week before, not accusing anything, just laying out the situation and asking him to be aware. Delaney was a fair man. He'd told me if anything happened to come for him, and he'd sort it out. The night they came, I was sitting in the main room with the lamp low. Had been that way for a week, sleeping light. Clara was in her room, but I knew she was awake because the room was quiet in the specific way of someone awake in a quiet room. The knocking was hard, fist on the door, not a knock, a pounding. I opened it with the rifle in my hand, held low, not raised, just in my hand. Ashby looked at the rifle and then at me. He said, "I want my wife." I said, "She's not here, go away." He said, "I know she's here, I've talked to people." I said, "You have a paper from a judge saying she's to be returned to you." He said, "I don't need one, she's my wife." I said, "You need one if you want to come into my house after hours. Go to the county seat, get yourself a writ of habeas, come back with the sheriff. Until then, you're standing on my property at night without invitation, and I'd like you to leave." The man with him on the roan hadn't said anything. He was watching Ashby the way a man watches someone when he's not sure what they'll do. Ashby said, "I'll have you up on charges for hiding her." I said I'd be happy to discuss it in front of a judge. My door's open to them, not to you, not tonight. He stared at me. I looked back at him. There wasn't much more to it than that. I've been around enough men in my years to know the difference between a man who'll push past a rifle in the dark and a man who just wants to. Ashby was the second kind. He went. I stood in the doorway until I couldn't hear the horses anymore. I closed the door and set the rifle down against the wall and sat on the bench and put my hands on my knees and held them there. Clara came out of her room. She stood in the hallway in the shadow and she looked at me. I said, "You all right?" She came to where I was sitting. She stood in front of me and she reached out and put her hand on the side of my face. Just her palm against my cheek, warm and very still. I held it there with my hand over hers. We stayed like that for a while in the dark room with the lamp low. Then she went to her room, and I sat there another hour, and then I went to bed. Delaney came out himself in mid-January. He'd heard about the night visit from someone, word travels in a small valley, and he wasn't pleased about it. He sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee, and I told him the situation plainly, the whole of it. Ashby, the marriage in Sheridan, the bruises, the way she'd come down the creek road in October with her shoes off and nothing but the clothes she stood in. He asked to speak to Clara. I asked her and she agreed. She came to the table and Delaney talked to her carefully, asking his questions and waiting while she wrote her answers and slid the paper across to him. He read each one with the same level attention he'd have given a spoken answer. After a while he sat back and folded his hands on the table and said, "I want to be straight with you, Miss Clara. He doesn't have a writ. He hasn't filed anything in Sheridan. As of right now, you're a woman who chose to leave a situation, and that's not against any law I'm charged to enforce. If he comes again without proper legal process, that's the issue, and I'll deal with it. Now, do you want to press a complaint about what he did to you?" She looked at her hands. Then she wrote, "Not right now. I just want to stay where I am." Delaney looked at me. Then he looked at her. He said, "From what I hear, you've done a considerable good for this family." She didn't write anything. She looked at the table. He said, "Stay where you are then. That's all the advice I've got." He drank the rest of his coffee and left. I walked him out to his horse and he said quietly, "I'll put the word out to Ashby through proper channels that if he shows up on your property again after dark, it'll be treated as a threat. That should handle it." I said I was grateful. He said, "You're a reasonable man, Russ. I appreciate you not making this into something it didn't need to be." He rode off down the road into the gray January cold, and I stood there in the yard for a while. Della walked to the kitchen table for supper on her own for the first time in January. She'd been doing short distances, but this was from her room all the way to the kitchen, 20-odd feet, with the brace and without holding anything. She came in and sat down, and we were both looking at her, and she said, "Are you going to stare, or are you going to pass the bread?" Clara put the bread in front of her. Della took a piece and buttered it and didn't look at either of us, which meant she was trying not to cry, which was the Calhoun way. We ate supper together, the three of us, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and I couldn't quite look at it straight on. That night after Della was in bed, Clara and I sat at the table with the last of the coffee, and she wrote on her paper, "How did you do it? All those months before I came." I said, "Do what?" She wrote everything, the ranch and the cooking and the stretching and the doctoring, by yourself. I said, "Didn't have a choice." She wrote, "You did the brace yourself." I said, "The one alderman sent fit wrong." She wrote, "I've seen the brace. It's better than what the doctor sent." I said, "Third try." She looked at that. Then she wrote, "There's something I want to say, and I'm going to say it on paper because it comes out clearer that way." I said, "All right." She wrote for a while, took up most of a sheet. She slid it across to me. It said, "I don't know what you saw when you found me in the creek. I wasn't much to look at, and I know that. I wasn't what I am now, I mean I wasn't settled. I've been running for 5 months by then, and running does something to a person. Takes the settled out of you. And you brought me in and fed me and gave me a room and let me be what I am, which is a woman who doesn't talk and doesn't explain herself and carries a history she isn't ready to hand over. You didn't ask me to be more than that. You just let me be what I was and waited. I haven't had much of that in my life. I haven't had people who waited. I want you to know that I know what you've done. I'm not going to pretend I don't know." I read it twice, then I looked at her. She was watching me with those steady dark eyes. I said, "Clara, you've given my sister back to me. I don't know how to put a weight on that." She shook her head, a small shake. I said, "Don't shake your head at me. You did that, nobody else." She looked at the table. She wrote on the back of the paper, "She would have fought through it anyway. She's a Calhoun." I said, "She's a Calhoun, that's true. But she'd have fought through it without the use of that leg, most likely. Maybe worse. What you did wasn't nothing." She sat with that. I said, "And I want to say something back to you. Clear, since you said yours clear." She looked up at me. I said, "I'm 53 years old, and I've been on this place 30 years, and I've been doing it by myself long enough that I stopped expecting anything different. That's not complaint. That's just what it was. And then you came out of that creek, and you made porridge the way my mother made it, and you never once asked me for more than you needed, and you came to me in the dark after Ashby left and put your hand on my face. And I want to know if it's something you want, if this is a place you could stay." She was very still. I said, "Not as hired help, not out of necessity, because you want to be here." She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I thought maybe I'd said the wrong thing. Then she picked up the pencil. She wrote one word. "Yes." I said, "All right then." She said, "Didn't write," said out loud, her voice rough and barely a voice at all, barely more than a breath shaped into a word. The first sound I'd heard from her in all the months she'd been here. She said, "All right." I sat very still. She was looking at me and her eyes were wet. I said, you don't have to push it." She shook her head, reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Kept it there. February that year was the hardest cold I can remember in 30 years on that land. -20 for a week, the creek frozen solid enough to drive a wagon across, the horses breathing steam in clouds so thick you could barely see their heads in the barn. I was outside for most of the daylight hours and came in at dark with my beard frosted, and my hands slow to close, and Clara would have soup on or beef on the stove, and the room would hit me like something physical, the warmth of it, and Della would be at the table doing her exercises, which she did twice a day now without being told. One night in that cold stretch I came in late, later than usual, some problem with a heifer in the barn, and the house was quieter than I expected. Lamp low in the kitchen. I went to the main room, and Clara was there in the chair by the window, asleep, a book open in her lap, the almanac, the same one I'd used to read to Della in those early weeks. She'd been reading it, which told me she'd been in this room tonight thinking about something, because nobody reads an almanac for pleasure. I stood there in my coat with the cold still on me, looking at her in the low light. She woke the way some people wake all at once, eyes open and present. She looked at me and seemed to take in where she was and closed the almanac and started to stand. I said, "Don't get up." She settled back, looked at me. I sat on the footstool across from her. It was too small for a man my size and my knees came up too high, but I sat on it anyway. I said, "You all right?" She nodded, then she wrote on the inside of the almanac cover she'd taken to writing on whatever was near. Yes, just couldn't sleep. What happened in the barn? I told her about the heifer. She listened. Then she wrote she'll be all right. She's been close before. I said, "You know that heifer?" She gave me the look that meant obviously. She knew all the animals. She'd been here 4 months. I said, "You know everything on this place." She thought about that. Then she wrote, "It takes me a while, but yes." I said, "Does it feel like yours?" Long pause. She wrote, "It's starting to." I said, "Good." She looked out the window into the black February night, the snow reflecting whatever moon there was back up into the sky, everything pale and still. Then she looked at me and wrote, "You should sleep." I said, "In a minute." I don't know how long we sat there. The stove went down and I fed it once and we stayed. I wasn't tired exactly, just wanted to be in the room. She seemed to feel the same way. She put the almanac on the floor and drawn her feet up under her in the chair, and she looked warm and still, and something about that, the warmth and stillness of her in a room that had been cold and empty for a long time, settled something in me I hadn't known was unsettled. I said, "Clara." She looked at me. I said, "I'm glad you were in that creek." She smiled. A full one, not the small one she gave out carefully. A full one, the kind that changed her whole face. She wrote me too. March came in wet and the ground thawed early and the creek ran high. Della was outside for the first time in 8 months, walking the yard slow in her brace, stopping to look at things, the mud, the returning meadowlarks, the horses moving in the field. Clara walked beside her, not holding her, just beside her in case. I watched them from the fence where I was stringing wire, watched the two of them make their slow way across the yard. Della stopped at the fence on the far side and looked across the field and said something to Clara. Clara wrote something back. Della laughed loud, the way she used to laugh, and turned back toward the house. I don't know what was said. I didn't ask. In April, Alderman brought his wife out for a Sunday and they ate supper with us, the 4 of us around the table with Della, and afterwards his wife asked Clara would she ever consider coming to town once a month, just once a month, to show her what she knew about the plants and the compresses. She said there were women in town who'd like to learn. She said there were children who might need what Clara had. Clara looked at me across the table. I gave her nothing. It wasn't mine to give, just looked back at her. She looked at Mrs. Alderman and she wrote on the slip of paper by her plate, "Once a month, with someone who knows me going along." Mrs. Alderman looked at me. I said, "I generally go to town Wednesdays." She said Wednesdays would suit us fine. Delaney told me later that Ashby had left the county in February. Gone back to Sheridan or further, nobody knew. He was gone. Clara knew it too when I told her, and she was quiet with it for a day, the way you're quiet with the end of something that's been over you for a long time, even when the end is good. She came to find me in the barn that evening. I was oiling a bridle. She stood in the doorway and she wrote on her paper and held it up so I could read it from where I was. It said, "I'm not afraid anymore." I looked at that for a while, then I said, "Good, that's where you ought to be." She stayed in the doorway, hip against the frame, the evening light coming in behind her. I said, "You feel like you're staying." She put the paper in her pocket. She came across the barn to where I was and she stood close, closer than she usually stood, and she looked up at me and she said out loud, her voice low and a little rough and real, said it with more ease than she'd had in February, more ease than I expected. She said, "I'm staying, Russ." I put the bridle down. I put my arms around her. She put her head against my chest and she held on. We stood there in the barn with the evening coming on, the horses moving slow in their stalls, the smell of hay and leather, and the green cold smell of April on the air from outside. I didn't say anything, didn't need to. That fall, the second fall she was here, she went to town on Wednesdays. She went with me in the wagon, sitting up on the seat beside me, and we drove in mostly quiet because quiet suited both of us. She spent the morning with Mrs. Alderman, and whoever came, 3 or 4 women usually, sometimes more. I did my business and ate lunch at the counter at Pruitt's and picked her up at 2. Della went to school that fall, first time since she'd gotten sick. She walked in on her own with the brace and sat down, and that was that. There was a Wednesday in November when I picked Clara up at the Alderman's, and she climbed up onto the wagon seat, and she was quiet in a particular way, not the usual quiet. We were halfway home before I asked. She wrote on her paper and handed it over without looking at me. It said, "One of the women today." She has a little boy, 3 years old. She thinks he might be getting sick, the same way Della was sick. I looked at the road ahead of us. She wrote on another slip, "I told her to bring him next Wednesday. I think I can help." I said, "You can." She took the paper back. On the bottom, she wrote something else and handed it back. It said, "I didn't think I'd ever do this. Any of it. I thought when I came down your creek road, I thought I was going to keep running until I ran out of road." I looked at that a while. Then I said, "You came to the right creek." She took the paper back. The horses moved along at their own pace on the road home. The valley spread out around us in the low November light, the hills going brown and the creek running thin between the banks. She put her hand through my arm the way she'd started doing, her hand in the crook of my elbow, and she looked out at the valley. I could feel the weight of her hand there, solid, particular, the way something feels when it's where it belongs. The ranch came into view around the bend, the house sitting low against the hillside, smoke from the chimney, Della visible in the yard doing her afternoon walk along the fence. She saw the wagon and raised her hand. I raised mine back. Clara raised hers. We drove on down.